Hello guys, and welcome back. Today we'll be changing the oil on my Kawasaki Vulcan 750. Now this bike is another one of my projects. It's pretty rough, but I got this bike for $500 out of Wyoming, actually from a buddy of mine. Today we're going to be changing the oil on it and doing some basic maintenance items. It's a great bike. It's really loud. Glad to bring you guys along. Now, one of the best things you guys can do if you have a vehicle is to get a paper manual of it. In this big, thick book, it'll tell you everything you need to know about your vehicle, all the specs, and most importantly, how to fix really anything. Now, the internet does exist today, makes things easy to look up, but you might not always have access to it. If you're out in the bush, if you're out in the wilderness, and you don't have any service and you break down, this is a great way to keep as a backup. That way you always have at least some idea on how to fix something. Now, even though this book is pretty thick and might look intimidating, it's really not that bad. Up here on the second page, that's the third page. Second page, you got your table of contents. We'll go ahead and we'll look down this. It looks like we're going to chapter 3, which is lubrication, maintenance, and tune-up. Now here in chapter 3 on our first page of the chapter, we'll see routine checks. This page, as well as this one, and I do believe this one, will tell you all the little things you need to check when you do your routine maintenance. Now, even though something like that isn't wrong, like the cooling system, for example, it's still a good idea to check. A lot of cooling systems, most actually use rubber hoses, and those can dry rot and crack, and down the road, you can crack your line open, spill coolant everywhere, and then you're stuck on the side of the road. So by inspecting these every oil change, every few thousand miles, it is called preventative maintenance, and it makes sure that all your parts are in tip-top shape and that you won't break down or have any problems. It's the best way to keep vehicles alive. All right, so first here we got engine oil level. Now I know it's low, and I'm planning on replacing the oil, so we'll skip that step for now. Number 2 is fuel. Now, there's a lot here in fuel, but we're just going to do this kind of the improvised way. We'll start from the bottom and work our way down. Here we have our fuel tank. We want to make sure that there's no rust or big dents. As you can see on this side, we do have a small dent here, but it's not leaking any fuel, and the paint hasn't cracked enough to where it is rusting, causing a fuel leak. Other thing to check is the filler itself. This one's a little screwed up and leaking a little bit of fuel, which is a little bit of a problem, but we want to make sure that the gasket's all right inside the fuel cap, and that while you're driving down the road, it's not going to spew fuel everywhere. Moving on down the line, this is called a peacock. It's on the bottom of the fuel tank. This is where the fuel comes out. Here we have our fuel switch. Now, when you store a bike like this for an extended period of time, you would want to turn it off, just like that. You also have on, and then up here is RES for reserve. This is kind of an emergency option so that if you run out of fuel, you can turn this to reserve, and now you have a little bit of extra fuel. So we'll turn that off. Secondly, we want to check all of our fuel hoses like this and all of our clamps. See, this one isn't leaking. It's not in the best shape, but it's not leaking. That looks good. Then, if it focuses, right there we have our fuel filter. Now you do want to replace that regularly. This one was just replaced. Most of them are clear, and so you're able to look in there for debris. That one is looking pretty clean, so it should be all right for now. Now, moving down here to the carburetor. This is the next stop for the fuel. As you can see, this carburetor is leaking fuel. Now, we will go through that, kind of define and see where it's leaking from, and we'll try to fix that. Now, after some looking at it, my guess is it's coming out of this drain valve here. Sometimes when the carburetor floods, it'll spit excess fuel out, which is completely normal. I think that's kind of where we're getting our buildup. Also down here, you can see there's a gasket, and it's looking pretty oily to me. Now that gasket may or may not be blown. Either way, the leak is not too bad. I'm not too worried about fixing it right now. Most of the time, if you buy a bike or you have a bike that's been sitting for a long time and it just will not start, the absolute first thing to check is your carburetor and your spark plug. We'll get to the spark plug in a minute. But often the jets inside the carburetor that shoot the fuel out can get clogged up. They're very, very small. They're, probably half or a third of a millimeter in diameter. Those can get clogged up and not deliver any fuel, as well as some other components in there that move over time can get stuck or sticky. By rebuilding a carburetor with a carburetor kit, it allows you to clean it out, make sure all the parts are working again, and I would say 90% of the time, that's your issue right there. Now, newer bikes and newer vehicles for the matter are fuel injected. So they have a pressurized fuel system and a fuel injector that injects the fuel into the cylinder. But most of these old bikes, as well as a lot of older vehicles, use a carburetor. The carburetor mixes the air and the fuel beforehand and then pushes it into the cylinder. Next on our list to check is the cooling system. A lot of very old bikes were something called air-cooled, which means they had more extended fins like this, and the air itself would actually cool the engine down. Now, on bigger engines like these and newer bikes, as well as all vehicles, you need a more efficient way to cool down the engine. Up here, we have our radiator. Our radiators consist of a bunch of small fins. It's really hard to focus on, apparently. There we go. Bunch of small fins in here. The coolant trickles down between the fins, and as you're driving, the air goes into these between the fins, and that's what cools down your coolant. Now, a lot of time, rocks or other debris will kick up into here. This one has a nice protector on it, but these delicate little fins will crack, and then coolant will leak out. So you want to check the front side as well as the back side of your radiator and make sure that you don't see any coolant running down. Secondly, we have our coolant lines. We have one right here as well as one down here. And then you can trace those back into the engine. You want to make sure, just like the fuel lines, that they aren't brittle or dry rotted. You want to check your fittings as well. And then lastly, you want to check your fuel level, which happens to be in this cylinder. And there's no coolant in there. So we'll go ahead and add some coolant to the level as described in the manual. All right, guys, we had to head to the parts store to get some coolant. I thought I had it. Turns out I do not. On the way up here, I saw a guy driving his truck home without a tire on the rim, which is a clear example of what happens when you don't maintain your vehicles. That's what we're trying not to do here. I'll insert that clip right here. It's pretty funny. All right, we're back from the parts store with our coolant as well as an oil filter I forgot to pick up. Now, the bleeder screw as well as the oil fill is halfway under this cover and the fuel tank. So we'll go ahead and remove both. You can see we have the fuel tank off and pulled back a little bit. I didn't want to take it all the way off. I didn't want to mess with that if I didn't have to. That is the fuel selector valve. Awesome. And that gives us opportunity to the filler cap as well as the bleeder screw. Now we're gonna go ahead and drain the old coolant. We'll head under the bike here to the crankcase where you will see this 10mm bolt. That's the first one we gotta crack. And then we will also crack the bottom of the radiator bolt to drain the radiator. That's a 10mm, that's a 12mm. We'll go ahead and set our catch pan under here and get those open. All right, we got the one removed down there. Now we'll go ahead and get this one. We'll just let that drain out. We'll also crack this filler up here so that it will drain a lot easier. There we go. Little spill right there. I won't tell anyone if you don't. Another great thing to mention is whatever you do, do not open this cap when the bike is hot, when it's been running. If the coolant is hot and it builds up pressure, the second you crack that, the cap will fly off and it will spew a lot of really hot coolant all over the place. So whenever you're doing this, always make sure you can touch your exhaust pipe and that the engine is not hot. All right, we're just gonna let this coolant drip out. I cleaned up this mess here, which brings up another great point. If you have rags or a paper towel like this that are soaked in fluids such as coolant or oil or gasoline, whatever it may be, you gotta watch out about putting them in the trash can. Another one that's really popular is things like aircraft, paint remover, paint thinner, acetone, stuff like that. If you put them all in a trash can together, it can do something called spontaneous combustion. That's where the oils and the chemicals in the different fluids react with each other, create heat, and light on fire. Now, there's been a lot of shops and a lot of houses burned down because of that. They do make trash cans that are fireproof. In case of such thing, they're required in all commercial shops. Now you can get one of those, or if not, you can always throw them out in a small trash can outside for a few days to vent off, or you can also burn them. All right, there's only two more places we gotta drain our coolant from. We have one on this front piston right here, and then on the other side, there's a drain for the rear piston. We'll go ahead and put some paper towel in there to catch the fluid coming out. We'll put our socket on. Took two hands to crack that one. We'll take this screw out and let that drain. Now it looks like this one does not have anything in it, which could mean that our coolant level was a bit low. We'll check this one just to be sure, but I'm guessing there's not gonna be anything in that too. Now, just as I suspected, there's no fluid coming out of that one either, so we'll go ahead and put that in. While we're here, we'll talk about the cooling system. So the coolant goes into the engine block here and goes throughout in kind of a snake pattern, and that is what ends up cooling down the engine. Now, this is the block of the engine, and right there you can see a gap, and this is what's called as the head. Inside the head, you'll have your spark plug, as well as your cam, your valves, and your exhaust. Now, it is common, not terribly common, but it will happen where this gasket in here, the head gasket, will start leaking. That can be caused from one or two things. There is the head stud, which connects the head to the block itself. Rarely, the head stud can fail, and it could cause it to stretch from the pressure inside the engine, causing a gap between the head and the block, and that would blow your head gasket. The other reason for blowing a head gasket is the gasket itself gets hot, it cracks, and starts leaking coolant. Now, how do you know if your head gasket is cracked? Well, the main reason to figure that out is to check your oil when you do an oil change. If the oil is a tannish color and has a milky consistency, then that could be a clear indication of a head gasket failure, as the coolant is leaking from the block into the oil itself. Now lastly, another way to know that you have a head gasket failure is the exhaust color itself. If the coolant ends up into the combustion chamber, it can turn the exhaust color a whitish bluish color. Now if you have an excess of that, that could be a cause of it. Another cause of smoke coming out the tailpipe, more of a whitish blackish color, is that the oil is seeping into the combustion chamber. Inside here is a piston. The piston goes up and down, and it has rings on it that seals itself within the combustion chamber itself. Those rings are delicate and they can become crushed, rusted, or cracked for whatever reason, and that would cause the engine oil to seep up into the combustion chamber, which causes that smoke. Now obviously on a diesel engine like Lucy here, black smoke can be kind of a normal, as diesel is a lot thicker than gasoline. It will burn a little smokier. Now, as your coolant is draining out of your bike, it's a good idea to check the coolant itself. If the coolant appears to be a brownish color or have small particles in it, like this coolant here, that could indicate that the internals of the radiator and your cooling system could be starting to rust and could be prone to fail. Now, as the coolant was coming out of the bike, it was a clear green color, which means this bike is fine. The only reason in here that is brown is because there was residual left in the tank from other things. Alrighty, and finally you're gonna want to drain your coolant reservoir itself. Now, I was a little confused about this here because on the manual, I didn't see this. Now, originally I thought it was the coolant reservoir, but I saw a picture of the coolant reservoir which looked very different, which made me think this was a degas tube. Turns out this is an aftermarket reservoir. The stock one fits into this part right here. Either way, if it's right there or you have an aftermarket one, you're going to want to drain that as well. Once that is done, it's time to start filling up the coolant. And take your coolant and pour it into the inlet right up here. Now you want to do this slowly so that you don't trap any air bubbles into the system. You could use a funnel or you could just pour it in there. Alrighty, we got our coolant added up to that line there inside that reservoir. Still bubbling out a little bit, but we'll go ahead and crack this bleeder screw and we'll pour coolant in here until it starts running clean out of here without any bubbles. Alrighty, we got our bleeder screwed tight as well as our cap. Finally, we'll just go ahead and fill up our reservoir down here. Perfect, we got it filled up just below that overfill hose. We'll go ahead and put that cap on, and that completes the the cooling system. Alrighty, we got the fuel tank and these trim pieces back on. Now we'll move on to the oil change. We'll start off by removing this lower oil plug on the bottom of the crankcase. Now this plug, as I found out, is a little bit stripped and rounded out by someone previous. And so it's a 17 mil. I tried 16 mil, I tried other sizes, and it didn't work. I'm afraid that if I put too much pressure on it, it's just gonna round out even more. So this is a little trick. I'm gonna put our socket on like this, and then hit it with a hammer in order, bear with me, to try to get that unstuck. Also known as the poor man's impact. It didn't quite work. I still wanted to round out. I've sprayed some lubricating oil, PB Blaster, on it. Hopefully that kind of helps loosen it up. Last trick I'm going to try is taking a punch, putting it directly on the bolt head, and lightly tapping it. Now, if you tap too hard, you could crack the aluminum case, which is terrible. You don't want to do that, but some light taps might help break up everything in there that's stuck. Now that didn't help too much, so the next step, which will destroy your bolt, but I plan on putting a new one in anyways, is using a chisel onto the nut and tapping that, trying to get it to rotate over. Well, we got some good news and bad news. Good news is bolt came out and we were draining the oil. Bad news is the bolt came out because it broke internally. So it'll be very hard to see from the camera. So you can see the remnants of the bolt inside of there. Now, fortunately, when it did break, it loosened it up. So I'm just using a chisel and a hammer, and I'll work my way around it until I get it threaded out. Once that happens, I'll order a new bolt and put a new bolt in there. This is a reminder, when we go to tighten your oil bolts, do not crank them down. They do not need to be that tight. Snug, quarter turn, that's it. If you tighten them too much, or God forbid, use something like Loctite, then it makes the next guy that has to change your oil hate his life. So please, just barely snug it up. All right, guys, we're back. I got the drain plug in, this guy right here. So we'll go ahead and install it back into the bike. All right, so first off, we gotta get rid of this old oil filter. Now, they do make a wrench for these, and I have one, but it is for a car size. This one's a little smaller. So we'll see if we can't get it by hand. Oh wow, that wasn't on there tight at all. All right. Out with the old one, we'll check the oil in there, kind of take a look at it, and it's looking pretty good. Just kind of looking for a milky texture or metal shavings. If you really want to, you can split these open and look, but I'm not too worried about it. Awesome, we'll let that kind of drain. All right, we're gonna take some of our oil. I went with the Mobile One Racing 4T. It's a 10W40. Crack that open. I'll set that off to the side and we will grab our oil filter. I'm using a Wix filter, they're pretty good. This is a 5135-8. Open that up. This is pretty important. We're gonna take our finger and dip it into some of our new oil, and we'll coat this O-ring. That'll do kind of two things. One, it'll help it seal better, and then two, it'll prevent it from dry rotting. So I gotta look down there, and we'll get that spun on there. Now you can use a wrench to tighten this if you want to, but I don't think it should be a problem if we don't. All right, our new oil filter is in and the old one's out. All right, as you can see, our bike is looking a lot different from the last time you saw it. It's torn apart, the wires are out. It doesn't look like a bike anymore. I'm in the middle of doing a build on it. Watch out for that video. That video will come out here soon. But now that we got our oil filter in, we'll put our new drain plug in. So go ahead and grab that oil, the new stuff here, dip a finger in it, and put it on this O-ring inside of our new bolt. Perfect, we got that in there. Go ahead and thread it in down here. It's a little bit harder when your hands are covered in oil. All right. Good to see that it threads in. I got this off of Amazon. It was pretty hard to track down, so I'm glad we got the right one. Now it's not the highest build quality. It's some sort of aluminum, kind of like the last one, but it kind of is what it is. Now I'll just grab the appropriate size wrench, which is not that one. There we go. It's a 17 mil. And we'll get that to where it is snug. All right, as you can see, it is snug. Now this part is very, very important so that you don't have the same mistake I just did, where someone else cranked it down really hard and it broke coming out. So once it's snug, all you have to do is just give it a 1/4 inch turn to tighten that O-ring and complete that seal. You do not need to crank it down as tight as you possibly can. Perfect. Now that we got our new oil filter in and our new oil drain plug, we will start adding oil here into the fill cap. Now, in the manual, it said this requires 4 quarts. Not too sure if that's exactly true, but we'll start filling it up slowly. Oh, a little spillage there. Hey, that's all right. That'll happen on them big jobs. Now, you can obviously use a funnel. That'll make this process a little bit more neat. And you can see down here, there's a little sight glass window, and that's where we will be checking to see the oil level. We'll go in with our 2nd quart here. And then use our flashlight to look into the sight window. And I'm not seeing any oil yet. Looks like we got a little ways to go. In with number 3. Man, I cannot pour straight today. Now, it does say that this engine does take 4 quarts of oil, but you gotta understand that's what's called dry. So our dry oil level is 4 quarts, but since there was oil in it, it will be a little bit less than 4 quarts, as there's still some residual in the engine. And we'll go in with our final quart. I can just kind of see it pop into the window there. So I'll go ahead and pour about half of that. Settle for a second and check our window. All right, we are reading full on our little window gauge down there. We'll go ahead and take our cap. And one last time, get some oil on your finger from the new oil and make sure you lube up that O-ring. Again, with this oil filler cap, you can see it just has this straight fin right here, which means it's meant to be open with your fingers, so you don't want it too tight. Just kind of snug it down. Perfect. That looks like it'll conclude our oil change. Alrighty guys, this is the Honda Magna. I just picked this up today. We'll finish the rest of the video on this bike because it's a little bit more complete than the other one. We're gonna start off by checking our lights. Make sure that all those work, turn that on. Make sure that your high and low beams do work. There's high, there's low, perfect. You'll also want to check your turn signals, left and right. Make sure those are functional. This bike does not have turn signals, something we gotta work on. And then a very important one, I'll set you guys up here so you can watch for me. Is our brake light. We want to make sure that our brake light does in fact work. So we'll test the front brake as well as the rear brake. Awesome, that looks like it's working well. Alrighty, we'll also want to check our battery. We're back over to this bike just because it's readily available. You'll want to make sure that the battery itself is in good condition, it's not leaking, it's not burnt. You want to check your terminals, make sure there's no corrosion, and then check your wiring as well, kind of just a once through. This is bad. You don't want all your wires out in the open. Obviously, that'll get wrapped up and cleaned up, but you want to check those as well. Back over to this bike, we're going to want to check our fork seals. So you want to look right here and make sure that there's no oil dripping out of here. As you can see on this bike, there is a little bit of oil, meaning that these fork seals are going to have to be replaced soon. You can see they have little tiny cracks in them and they're dry rotted. So you want to make sure that those are good. You also want to get up on the handlebars and push down and make sure that they're not too soft, and then as well in the rear. Now these have bars across. They've deleted the stock shocks. I'll be sure to put those back on. You want to check those seals as well. Now we'll kind of move on to brakes here. You have two brakes, your front and your rear. On a chain or belt drive, it's very easy to check the rear brakes. On a bike like this that is shaft drive, it makes it very hard. So you can take the back tire off, crack it open, check the brake pads. But you don't really have to do that necessarily every time. We'll just make sure we do have brake pressure. Now, if your brake pedal here is very loose in the top end and then it only engages at the bottom end, that could be bad because your cable is loose. So you go back here to your tensioner, screw that little nut in here, and put tension on it so that it engages kind of right off the bat. You can see we have a little bit of play there, which is what you want, so that you're not constantly rubbing your brake pads, but then the brake engages like that. We'll go up here to our front brake. Here we have a very cracked bubble gauge. You can't really see too well through there, but you want to make sure that that is topped off with fluid and that your front brake, just like the rear, is engaging within a short distance. That way you're not having to squeeze it all the way down and you're losing brake pressure. Throttle is a very important one. You want to make sure that it bounces back A lot of these older bikes, especially, the throttles will stick on them, which, as you can imagine, is very dangerous. So we want to check that as well. Our clutch, you want to check your handles in classic bike fashion. You can see this bike had been laid down. The handles are broken off, so we'll want to go ahead and replace those at some point. And then check your clutch as well. Just like the brakes, you want to make sure that it engages. You can see this one is actually maybe just a little bit loose. We'd want to tighten that up as well. And then another very big thing is we want to check tires. Now coming down here, I forgot to mention, we're gonna wanna check our front brake as well. Wanna make sure we still have a bunch of material left there, that it's not worn down too much. We wanna make sure that the wear is even. Now, you can see there's a little bit of a lip there on either side, which means this rotor is pretty worn. Probably should be replaced in the near future. Want to check all of our hydraulic connections here, make sure we are not leaking any hydraulic fluid to the brakes. And then looking from over here, we're going to want to check our brake pads. You can see that brake pad there. Still got a good amount of life on it, but could be replaced soon as well. Awesome. Lastly, we're gonna go over tires. Now you have your two tires, obviously your front and your rear. What we're checking for when we check for tires is, first off, air pressure. We'll go ahead and put a gauge on that and see what that's reading. All right, we got our air pressure gauge here. It's as simple as just screwing off this valve cap. Just like so. And then you can see we'll zero this out and we'll put our gauge on it. Might go on better just like that. All right, looks like we're reading about 25 PSI. We will check the tire itself and look for the specifications. Alrighty, I looked, and on the side here, it said it should be around 25 to 30 PSI, so we are well in range. And then you'd also go ahead and do that on the back tire as well. We're gonna look over the condition of our tires. This one is looking pretty good. You wanna make sure you have plenty of tread left and make sure that you have some depth in there. And then you also wanna check for uneven wear. If the tire is worn down on the center of the tread here, that means it's overinflated and your tires will wear faster. If the tire is too low, it will wear the sidewalls, as well as splotches or other worn areas over the tire, because it also indicate things like our front wheel not being centered on the forks. We'll check our rear tire here as well. And this one's looking pretty good as well. Looks about similar to our front tire. Now we're over here on my dad's bike, and as you can see, his back tire is awful. It is worn down. There's no tread left on the center. And if you run your finger along it, it's very uneven. It has a lot of high and low spots. Don't worry about that. We got a new tire ordered in. And then lastly, we'll just kind of give it a once over. We're gonna look all over the bike, paying very close attention to the frame. Now, what can happen is these frames can stress and they can crack, and that could be a very serious safety concern. So I'm gonna look all over the frame, check for cracks, check for alignment as well, and you wanna make sure that it's also not rusting in some parts. Now, kind of a easy way to check alignment is just come to the back of the bike, close one eye and run your eye down it, and make sure that it is not tilted to the left or the right, up and down, just like that. And you can also do the same from the front of the bike. Now, lastly, the things you'd also want to check is the spark plugs and the carb. 99% of the time, when a bike is not running right or it's not starting, you want to check the sparks as well as the carburetors. Often, with changes in elevation, The air to fuel mixture ratio will change, and that can throw the carb off and the bike won't run right. I can go over a video of how to adjust the carb and clean spark plugs or replace the spark plugs. If you guys would like to see that, just comment down below. I'd be happy to. Alrighty guys, that's everything the book says to do on an inspection. Also inside your book, you'll have a table basically describing the service intervals of when you want to do these things. Obviously, a thing like an oil change will be every few thousand miles. Spark plugs and brakes might be, every 10,000 miles or something like that. You can see with my new bike here, the Honda, we also went ahead and picked up a manual book for that as well. Thank you guys for following along. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm excited for you guys to see this bike running once I get it done, and then this bike as well. Awesome. Thank you guys. Have a great night. This is Foley signing out.